Welcome to Driving Green, a podcast on green technology and supply chains. This is episode number 3, recorded February 28th, 2021. This episode is about the winter storm that hit Texas in February. At its height, it took out power for 4.4 million people. We discuss the unique nature of Texas's grid, the events that led up to this catastrophe, as well as whether or not clean energy was truly to blame, as some said. At a time when our nation is considering unprecedented investment into infrastructure, we felt it was important to stop and have a retrospective on just what went wrong in Texas. Enjoy.
Boy, was I proven wrong. I did not pack any winter clothes, got to Dallas and was getting ready to fly out only to find out it was snowing. Every single flight was canceled. Ended up going back to the hotel and being snowed in.
That was
when I realized.
Or was that 2011?
I don't remember. It was. I think it was 08.
Kevin's old.
I think it was 08.
Kevin's old. He's missing his year.
Well, it could have been a snowstorm in 08.
Oh man, calling out my age.
Oh.
2011 was the previous snow event that crippled their grid.
Kevin, this is your topic.
Hey man, I don't know history as well, but I will say I studied. I took a much deeper dive in this one.
All right. Let's fast forward. What went wrong?
What went wrong? Well, you still have to understand a little bit about Texas and where they get their energy sources. Like in 2020, about half of it comes from natural gas. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And 20% came from coal, 20% came from wind. And then that last 10 to 12% comes from everything else. Nuclear, solar, that's where everything else is. But, when we talk about the main sources of energy for Texas, it's natural gas, followed by coal, and very closely followed by wind. Number 2, the grid is, most of Texas is on its own separate grid from the rest of the U.S. And thus, Texas has its own department that manages and plans electrical generation capacity for all months of the year. Normally, what they do is they aim for about 10 to 15% buffer of additional generation capacity when compared to prior peaks. And the peak season of Texas power consumption has always been in summer. And those are all very important things to understand. There's always planned reserves for power generation, and it's always measured against summers when, during the months where electricity has its highest usage. So just wanted to level set everything. So what went wrong? One, most of the stuff I read, at least the things that pop up in my news feed, is half the people blaming wind energy. And I think that's completely misguided. Wind, yes, it makes up 20% of Texas energy, but the planners who are behind managing the entire electrical grid knows that during the winter months, there's just not that much wind. They don't plan for the wind farms to generate all that much. So of the 20% that of energy that it produces, I think the planners at that time was thinking it will only produce about 30% of that total capacity.
And
they were pretty much right on that.
What's like normal variance though? So like, can your energy generation drop 30% without majorly affecting the grid? Or is it a matter of like, there has to be a level of predictability where if you don't have the predictability, it doesn't matter if it's only a 5% drop, it'll still mess up the grid. Like which of those two things really matter more?
Well, I was going to say that specifically when it comes to energy generation in the grid, as it pertains to Texas, they are deregulated, and like Kevin said, they are not attached to the western or eastern interconnects that basically connect every other state within the continental United States, or at least contiguous United States. And they are broken up by, in Texas, ERCOT, which is the regulator / traffic cop, the one that actually manages the grid, and independent power generators. And those generators are leveraging natural gas, coal, wind, solar, nuclear. And they have an amount of capacity that these generators can generate. I say generators, I don't mean an actual physical generator. They are a generator of power, and each one of those generators of power can scale how much they're outputting to the grid, and it is a constant balance of supply and demand. And so, yes, when you say that you have X number of megawatts that can come from this, that, or the other, there are times, of course, during the day that solar will be available, and you can leverage and use that available power and offset it, whatever demand you have, the gap between the available solar and what is being demanded of you, with the natural gas, with the coal, with the nuclear, with all of your supplementary sources. So that's roughly how they.
I get that conceptually, but like when it comes to how this situation happened, was it where, if these three sources make up 30% and they could double their output to 60%, and that wasn't enough because everything else got knocked out, right? And that created like a 40% deficit. Is that something that happened, that even with, foreseeing that it wasn't enough? Or was it a situation where they didn't predict that the winter storm would be this severe and they weren't able to get the other sources to ramp up their capacity in time to match the need?
No, that's Ron. Like, if we go back to wind and just specifically focusing on wind, the wind portion of it, wind was planned as Kyle has talked about. Wind was planned to be down 67%, right? So wind was only supposed to produce about 33% of its total capacity during those months, irrespective of the storm. Wind was not a problem. They knew that it was not going to generate a lot of energy. The problems came from natural gas and coal, and what cold temperatures did to the generation capabilities of those two areas. And so when we come back to your question about, hey, what's driving this and where the risks are, wind wasn't it, natural gas and coal was.
So natural gas was supposed to be the normal overcompensation during the winter season for less wind energy, but the natural gas lines were frozen, and that was unanticipated because of the severity of the storm, and the other power sources weren't able to, match what the needs was as a result.
It was actually quite interesting. Both sources of natural gas and coal had several redundancies in place. What was most interesting was the fact that freezing temperatures takes out every single redundancy. And so if we talk about natural gas, first of all, winters are known to be slow months. So what do these power generation companies do that are independent? They spend that time preparing for the summer. They take certain plants off, they take certain fleets off to run maintenance. And the whole point of maintenance is so that when the summer months come, they are ready for peak demand. They do it when the energy usage is lowest, which for Texas historically is winter. So some of that was lost due to maintenance. Second, some of the stuff you just described, Ron, was part of the infrastructure because there was no winterizing. A lot of the natural gas was frozen. A lot of the pipes were frozen. A lot of other things were frozen that made movement much slower. So gas couldn't move as fast. Certain things were stuck, certain areas. And so they couldn't use some of the supply for those reasons as well. And then finally, natural gas is first allocated to heating, second to electricity. So if there's issues, natural gas is automatically pumped into the heating pipes versus being pumped into electrical pipes for electrical generation. So natural gas was being attacked from 3 different sources, all because of cold temperature related reasons. So there were a lot of other redundancies in place, but every single thing for natural gas sort of fell by the wayside as capacity was taken off for maintenance. Next, there was non-winterization of technical equipment caused failures, and then finally, the allocation of resources first to prioritizing heating over electricity.
So I know that both of you said that this was unstoppable, right? In terms of like what could have been done about this specific situation. Is that something where Texas would have been connected to the grid? In your thoughts, there might have been mitigating factors to that, or is it something where we need totally new, different energy generation sources, or is the cost of creating those additional weatherproof redundancies even too much of a cost relative to the fact that this might be like a once every 10-year freak incident or like whatever?
Well, I mean, I think that it could have been avoided or at least diminished, right? So I think it's important that we actually go back and say what occurred. Not just there was a disruption to power, but millions of people were plunged into darkness, had no electricity, and that was largely due to the fact that at ERCOT, the regulator who was effectively managing all of the power generation, they had notified all of their generators, don't perform any maintenance, be prepared for this winter storm event. But the winterization requirements or recommendations that they had put forth, and the federal government had effectively put forth after the 2011 winter storm that had done a very similar thing, took out a lot of power within the grid, a lot of customers without electricity, was that they said you need to winterize, right? So I think that part of this could have been diminished had they winterized many of these facilities. What occurred during the storm, during the early hours or at least days of the storm that basically led to so many people losing power, was that I think it was 186 generators of power within the grid, making up nuclear, coal, natural gas, wind, solar, effectively all went offline within an hour of one another. So these extremely frigid temperatures rolled in, immediately began taking these systems offline. And with the grid, the power regulation within the grid is extremely delicate between supply and demand, right? And so when supply begins to drop, but demand does not, which in this case it was during the overnight hours, demand was actually going up because the temperatures were going down. People are trying to heat their homes. Texas homes are not insulated. So demand kept rising, supply kept dropping. And without boring you with the details, there's a very catastrophic series of events that can take place in which, if your voltages are not properly regulated, and you begin to send, basically you begin to increase the resistance within the grid. Power lines begin to heat up, they begin to expand, they begin to sag, they come in contact with things and can spark fires. And what they basically had a situation of was, if they didn't begin to start rolling blackouts, voluntarily taking large chunks of customers offline, they were going to have to shut the entire grid down. So the line that's been circulated is, we came within 4 minutes and 30 seconds of a catastrophic failure. And I kept digging into that, saying, what is a catastrophic failure? What do you mean by catastrophic failure? Because they kept saying, we came within 4 minutes of being down for months, not just a few hours of no power, but actually being down for months. And when you dig into that, what they mean by that is that if they shut down the grid, there are many power generators that require power to start. So if you have a coal facility or a nuclear facility, many of these locations require that they have electricity before they can start their own operations. And so if you shut it all down, there's a very specific order of operations where you have to begin bringing everybody back online. You have to get all of your ducks in a row with, which parts of the grid are switched on or switched off. And so, yeah, it's such a convoluted mess where you can't really point your finger and say, this is the one place where they failed. The winterization, probably the biggest failure point. But the simple fact was they had no supply.
So
they were.
Yeah.
No, I was gonna say, Kyle, you're absolutely right. Right, like they were pushed to the point where they could only choose between literally a rock and a hard place, because all the planning and all the other things that need to happen to prevent them from being pushed in that situation was never done. And that's probably the most key thing, is that like this was not possible to prevent, given everything that's happened up to that point.
So basically, when you're saying it came within 4 minutes of a total shutdown for months at a time, and them having to pick where they are, and avoiding that catastrophic scenario, I think of the movie Chernobyl. Are you saying basically Netflix is going to turn this into a movie in 2 years? Because they need content constantly.
Well, that was HBO, and it was a mini series. But besides that,
Well, no, I think Ron is saying maybe Netflix will be competing with HBO here.
Yeah, on this. All right. So if I give you guys like enough NPR over here, right? If I gave you guys like a magic wand and I'm like, fix it, like, what would you do?
I mean, the very first thing is you get ERCOT or the Texas grid connected to the western and eastern interconnects right away. So they are already connected, but they're connected in very minuscule ways, not sufficient enough to be able to backhaul energy in the event of a catastrophic failure, which is effectively what would have happened if they were any other state. They would have been able to bring in power from other parts of the grid to offset what they were losing, but they couldn't. So the winterization, I think, is going to be a big issue. I think that they're going to be pushing that probably at a state and federal level, but they really have to get connected because the state has effectively prioritized cheap electricity over reliable electricity, right? Other states, being as a part of these inter exchanges of power, they pay higher prices, but they have far more redundancy and reliability. Should they lose all of their power generating capabilities, there's a winter storm, et cetera, they can bring that in. So I think Texans will probably kind of push that direction. It remains to be seen how they'll do it, but that's how I would, just right off the bat, if you're just talking about delivering reliable power, that's how you do it.
And I fully agree with Kyle. I mean, like, I think I would separate my answer into two different phases. In the short term, connecting to the other interconnects is too critical. You need to be able to pull power from a more diversified source, and being connected both east and west will give it to you immediately. Texas was very reliant on themselves, and a statewide event will cause them to just suffer the way they did. To be honest, there's no way of running from it.
So I'm going to go counterpoint to this and say, I'm going to read this quote over here. In August 2003, an overgrown tree branch in northern Ohio blew into a high voltage line, an alarm that cascaded into the failure of several northeastern states in southeastern Canada, with 50 million people left without power for 2 days, and they were connected to the larger multi-state grid. So for people who are going to bring that up, what is your response to that in a similar situation, despite being connected to a multi-state grid?
No, I mean, and this comes down to the fact that if that's why I'm separating my answer into two components. For the short term, right, you have to connect because it's your safest and most diversified way of lowering the risk. Yeah, another freak event like a tree branch knocking down the core power line can cause blackouts again. Right, but to prevent something like this happening next year or the year after, your fastest way is to connect to the interconnects and be able to draw upon power from other sources that are far outside of your geographic location to be able to make up for any supply shortfall.
Yeah, well, in that specific instance in 2003, that took out several states, including I think Toronto was also impacted by that. And the root cause analysis, well, first off, that was viewed extremely poorly. Federal government got just completely annihilated for gross negligence at a grid level from a federal regulation perspective, because yes, you have this interconnect that spans multiple states, and you have federal regulations that enforce and encourage and try to set standards that everybody plays by, but you're only as good as the participation and the compliance of each state, each utility, right? Because they're private entities in a lot of cases. And in that specific case, yeah, it was a down power line in Ohio, but as I recall, it was the operator had basically walked away from their terminal to go to lunch and didn't turn on the automatic controls that were supposed to handle freak events like that in the absence of a human operator. And so the grid was extremely fragile back in 2003. It's still probably way more fragile than it should be in 2021. But a lot of changes have occurred since then. But yes, exactly. You're making a good point, which is you're paying more power for redundancy and potential reliability, but you are incurring other risks because you are now dependent on and cooperating with other utilities, other states, and the federal government. That's effectively what Texas wanted to get away from, is they didn't want to necessarily have to play ball with any of their surrounding states or the federal government as a whole. They wanted to be able to be in control of their own destiny, and generate their own electricity cheaply. And it largely accomplished what it was to set out, that what they set out to do, but they cannot deliver on the reliability that a first world nation needs in a really, catastrophic weather event. So yeah, you're picking your poison, right?
When I hear about these issues from both of you, right, I think this is like whack-a-mole, where there's always these potential things that could go wrong, and it only takes one of them to execute to destroy everything. You could think of, 1,000 reasons why something could fail. You could protect against 999 of them. One thing happens, and it creates a disastrous effect where we're reading about people getting like hypothermia in like jails in Texas, right? So like, it's hard to have a universal answer, a magic wand that solves everything. And one thing when I read the story as a normie, that I don't really go into this in super in depth, that it makes me sad that people try to find a singular reason where it's a singular source of power generation or a single political decision to be energy independent and say, this is a solution. If you had just done this, none of this would have happened. And that might have been the case for this scenario, but I think Kevin has an example where this happens every year in California, where they have power problems due to wire frost. And I think this is a good transition to that topic and saying, look, different root cause, same end effect, people are still screwed over like you and me, right? So I think this would love to understand more about how this works in California versus Texas.
No, I mean, and this is absolutely the case, right? Like Texas is what started off this conversation for us, but if we go look at the state with the biggest power problem, it is hands down, in my opinion, California. Good old California and their summers. Backbreaking heat, highest power consumption, and lo and behold, wildfires that happen every year like clockwork. And unfortunately, no one ever talks about the power problem in California because it happens so often, people expect it. And that's probably the saddest part. Right, like Texas, this made national headlines because Texas losing power is once every 10 years. And another way of looking at Texas is their system might be even much more successful, because when things go wrong, people actually report about it. In California, well, I mean, if I remember correctly, I do live in California. I lost power last year, lost power the year before. I think the year before that was good, but that was the anomaly. And it's just sad for me to say that, but that's just the other truth. In California, these are the same problems. It happens in summer, and it all comes back down to what I want to divert us to for the next topic is what I think the longer term strategy is, and how we get away from what Ron has suggested to be, what you suggested to be a whack-a-mole problem. It's just not. These problems will continue to arise, whether it comes from wildfires, whether it comes from freak snowstorms, whether it comes from tree branches breaking. It could come from flooding. It could come from, cables being chewed away by rats. Who knows? But at least for me, from my standpoint, distributed generation, distributed storage, any kind of distributed electrical grid system is going to be the way of the future. Centralizing a lot of these problems come because everything is so centrally planned and centrally generated. That's fundamentally my position is distribution is the key.
And, I see this exciting future. We're talking about, everyone can generate their own power from solar panels on their house, store it in an energy storage solution like a Tesla Powerwall in their home. And if a blackout does happen, they can rely on that, and hopefully they have enough power to get them through the night while the panels start generating for the day, right? Now, you look at that, and I see two main problems. One is, how does that work in a winter storm, right? Can that only get you so far? And, we've read stories of how people, have even lived inside their Teslas that has kept them warm for a few days on low power. But how does that, what can you just power the fridge or power whatever? Is how realistic is it to rely? on that? Can you even generate enough electricity in the day during the winter time? And two, when you go on and you look on the website, it's really friggin' expensive, right? And we know the prices are coming down continuously on that. But at what point can we realistically go to like the majority of Americans and say, you can kind of find an economical argument to have energy storage in your own home to be self-sufficient?
I think it's important. There is no one size fits all. There's no red pill, blue pill that's just going to magically make everything go away. As it pertains to California, I think, or really any arid part of the United States, the grid itself sometimes is the cause of the wildfires itself, that then the wildfires are then, imposing rolling blackouts on you. And so when you look at kind of decentralizing this grid such that people have their own power generation, whether it's solar, et cetera.
Kyle, I do want to, I'm not saying decentralized grid. I'm saying decentralized generation, decentralized storage.
Yeah, I'm saying that the nuance here is that it's going to be a little bit different for California than Texas. It'll be the same 99% of the time, right? They're both relatively warm states, so you get a lot of sunshine. In a winter event, the folks that had power walls did really well, but in the most part, their power reserves went down, eventually depleted. If they had a rolling blackout where they could get power for a little bit, they could recharge and then kind of offset the amount of time that they were without power. But their solar panels were under snow. I looked into how effective would that solution have been if I was in that situation and all that. And most of those people said, hey, look, I got hours of precious heat. Something that you don't want to use battery power for, generating heat within your home. But when you're between a rock and a hard place, you do that. Some people got creative. It's cold outside. I can put the stuff from my fridge and my freezer out in the snow. And, at least I can save some of my backup power for the things that I need, which is heat and light. So, yeah, I think that for me, it's less about how it would have made my life more comfortable. I look at it more from the grid perspective, which is if we invest at an infrastructure level, instead of beefing up transmission lines and beefing up the power generators and beefing up all of the existing infrastructure that we already have to handle more people or handle lower temperatures, I think in conjunction with that, looking at, well, if every home or most homes or certain parts of the grid within Texas had battery packs and they needed to conduct rolling outages, those blackouts would disproportionately affect one group versus another. And you could take offline the people that had the power walls and know, okay, we know that they have X number of hours of average amount of power in their stores to be able to help the grid cope with a disastrous event. And I think it's a little optimistic because it's, right now it's opt-in. You pay the money, you buy it. It's, however many tens of thousands of dollars, depending on the size of Powerwall you want. And so you're never going to have this nice, clean, they're not going to be able to flip the switch and say, everybody with a Tesla Powerwall is now off the grid. And, everybody else, you're going to continue to draw off the grid. I mean, in theory, you could have a smart inverter that the utility can control and the utility could force you back onto your battery power. But if you paid for it yourself, chances are you're not going to want them to have that control.
No, and Kyle, you're absolutely right. Like decentralized storage is going to be so important. Decentralized storage and I think the problem I have a lot is when we talk about the grid, the only two things we really talk about is generation and the type of energy things generate. Nothing else is spoken about, transmission. Nothing else is spoken about storage. And even when people talk about decentralized solar, Kyle, you brought up a fantastic point. A lot of this renewable energy only works under certain conditions and in certain geographic portions of America. Right? In a winter storm, people think solar will be there, not if it's covered by snow and not if there's a lot of clouds. Just doesn't work. Texas has historically known wind doesn't work during winter because there's just not a lot of wind. And when there are, then you sort of run into winterization problems and the storm that came through. So there are a lot of issues with generation. What you really need is some kind of decentralized storage. And to Kyle's point, Kyle's suggesting, you're suggesting like power cells in people's homes. That's probably a great solution. And to be honest, I believe right now any solution, any additional already generated energy solution in key parts of the grid, whether it be people's homes, large businesses, or at key substations, those are all, in my opinion, legitimate answers that would de-risk on the wide level and increase reliability on by a significant factor for any kind of events like such as these.
So I know we have, subsidies on power storage, right, for power walls, but is that not enough? Does that need to increase? And like, what would the cost of that be for a bigger subsidy for people to buy a power wall in the home versus just beefing up, taking that money and allocating it to the grid? Is that even something that could be like, feasibly installed or enacted in there? Like, is there like a right answer one way or the other, right? Because I'm looking at a power wall and, even with the subsidy, it's like really expensive. It like doesn't make sense, right? And a lot of people are going to say that until like shit hits the fan and it happens to them, right? It's something where you don't appreciate it until it happens to you. So like, how do you even view that, right?
I think part of it is you have to, in my opinion, let capitalism kind of push the industry forward a little bit. There's obviously it's complicated. There's the available batteries, the battery supply chain, which is already being taxed for EVs, which will continue to be taxed for EVs, and yet we now want those batteries for another purpose. If you incentivize people to do that, obviously it'll increase demand for those products. Those products and those companies will in turn then put more pressure onto the battery supply chain. If you can drive those costs down, which I don't think they need any help pushing the costs down. I think demand is already there. I think investment is already there. But I don't expect that there will be enough supply in a short enough amount of time to cover enough of the United States to make a noticeable impact in too many places. I really do think that right now the Powerwall is very much a every man for himself or herself. I am protecting my own interests when this event occurs. Maybe it's once every 5 years, but I know it's not going to be a day-to-day thing where I'm, unless I have solar and I'm using this to kind of arbitrage energy and I'm selling it back to the grid or whatever, unless there's like a real incentive, a monetary incentive to like lower your power bill, and this is a component of that, I don't expect people to just go flock out and buy it unless they've been through something as horrific as being without power for 4 days and just the anxiety that gives you. Maybe you have the funds to just go buy it. But from an incentive, from incentivizing consumers, I don't think we'll be able to. It's not likely capital efficient to do it on a per person basis, right? We should probably be doing this at the grid level, at the utility level. The federal government stepping in and saying, hey, we'll help subsidize the cost of whatever, or the state government, and add a substation. You've got a battery backup that can help smooth things out. Wouldn't have helped in Texas, right? They just, everything got knocked out and they would have just run down the batteries and it would have been gone. But unless you pair it with some alternate generation, right? Texas is unavoidable, but your own personal power could have been somewhat less interrupted, right?
Yeah, and I do want to really highlight this. Like, we're not talking about you have a power cell that can power your normal day in, day out lives with centrally planned generation. You can't compare. These power cells are meant to be in situations where you still have heat. Maybe you get to charge your phone and that's it. It's not like you're going to be heating up your home, cooking, having the TV on the background, fridge running. You're like all those things that you normally enjoy in a daily life with a working grid. That's not the case. What we're talking about is that batteries are placed so that you can handle and take pressure off the grid while still providing energy to critical systems. At least that's what I'm talking about when I'm saying, hey, batteries should come first. Some kind of storage solution should come first. At some point, when our storage technology becomes extremely efficient and can store vast amounts of energy very efficiently and very cheaply, then maybe we can talk about it becoming a huge part of the grid. And it's where all the power generation feeds into it, and it's where all the power gets sucked out. But the technology is just not there yet.
Well, and battery technology is still evolving, right?
Mhm.
So Tesla is pushing forward with lithium-ion batteries, and that's what the three of us are mostly concerned with in the moment because we're looking at EVs. But there are other battery technologies. There's solid-state batteries. There's like redox flow batteries, wave batteries. All these battery technologies that are not efficient for a vehicle purpose or a cell phone, et cetera. They're not lithium-ion. Maybe they weigh 100 times more, but that doesn't matter if they're cheap enough and you can just stick them in a substation somewhere and they are volumetric and gravimetrically good enough for that purpose. Those technologies are currently in development. So I think right now, Tesla's approach of just shoving a whole bunch of lithium-ion batteries into a gigantic enclosure is definitely a brute force method of trying to approach this problem. But I do think that the technologies needed to solve this at a much larger scale probably don't exist yet. Because I don't see us being able to scale the lithium ion supply chain fast enough to handle the adoption rate of EVs and this renewable energy / sustainable battery, arbitrage program.
So when you look at that, like what it should be ideally in the future, like in 2030, like is the terawatt output of that's allocated towards EVs versus allocated towards storage, whether on the grid level or on an individual like household level. Like does it look like we're actually going to be needing more of that energy towards the storage, like home storage level, rather than towards EVs? Or like how does that ratio look like in 2030?
I mean, I think that part of this, and I hate to, I am very conflicted when it comes to the federal government. So I don't like big government, but at the same time, we also need to be able to have an authority. Unfortunately, the authority doesn't always know what's best for you. The authority doesn't always have the best ideas or understand the technology, but we need to come together as a society and all of these different technology partners come up with a solution, because we've got promising concepts. We've got V2G, vehicle to grid, right? Every EV being manufactured. What if it was a Powerwall? What if you plugged it in when you got home and it not only charged the battery, but could discharge the battery in a program that you participate in to help smooth out the Californian brownouts that occur every summer? But you can't really do that unless you get so many people to sign off on it, right? I think that right now, as a society, we have to figure it out from the top down and not just... I don't know if this can be solved by private enterprise like Tesla just pushing and pushing and pushing, because they definitely have a concept that they want to execute on, but I don't know if it'll solve all of our problems across state lines and regulators.
Well, so Kyle, I do agree with you 50%, I think.
That's more than normal.
Yeah, that is true. That is true. And I don't know about that. At least for this call, maybe that is true. But you know what? I would say the fact that, like, the cost for all of this stuff is just really high, and the demand from other sectors is going to only drive the costs up. So, Kyle, to your point, like, do we need top-down involvement? Absolutely, because of all the constraints and all the other regulations and costs of bringing this kind of technology online, is just too great for the normal consumer.
Well, not only that, but when we're talking about 1.9 or 2, I'm losing track of how many trillions of dollars they want to spend on infrastructure, right? Yeah. My fear is that we've got all this money that they want to throw at problems like this and won't know where to put it, or think they know where to put it, and it's just going to be, we're just going to build more substations, we're just going to build more transmission lines, and but the energy independent future.
I fully agree with you, man. Like, my best example is Australia, right? Like they came out with that football field or 2 football fields, or measured in football field size battery
plant.
Yeah, and that's amazing. But you know what? It was a government sponsored initiative. No private enterprise was ever going to take on that risk.
So I was big on V to G, right? I thought one of the biggest value props of having an electric car is that it straight up can be backup energy generation for you. Like a Cybertruck is like 8 Powerwalls or something like that. But I read like when they brought it up in Battery Day with Elon Musk, and he's like the US infrastructure, the grid isn't set up that way to do V to G very easily, right?
Yeah.
Do any of you two have like visibility into that? And maybe that's something that can be pushed for on a governmental level to make it easy so that your car can be your backup generator instead of you having to pay $15,000 for a Powerwall that only rich people can afford, right?
Yeah, so I think where Elon is coming from in that perspective, if you actually look at solar power and how it works when connected to the grid, you can have solar power with a Powerwall and not be tied into the grid from a energy feeding back to the grid perspective, right? When you choose to go that route, they give you an inverter that's called a grid tie inverter, and that inverter, I believe, feeds back not high voltage, but like 120 or 220 volts. I don't know exactly if the utility ties into it, but I think what Elon is effectively trying to say is, well, look, if you have solar power, it's a use it or lose it. It's being generated. The sun is hitting the panel. It's generating voltage. You need to decide where that goes. Does it go into a power pack or a power wall? What if it's already full, right? And so you're sending the electrons to the place that it needs to go, or any place that it can go. And the grid is effectively the overflow in most situations. If you can't use it, it's going to go there. If you're looking at a car in which you don't want it to be, run down to zero, or you only want to sell back power if it's advantageous to you. The car doesn't have its own generator, it doesn't have its own solar panels. It doesn't need to discharge to the grid. You would just be voluntarily doing that. But if you're going to just have to recharge it, the only arbitrage opportunity is to charge it when it's cheap and discharge it back to the grid when it's more expensive. And even then, you would need to know when those points are. So Tesla themselves would probably have to work it out with the utility to be able to calculate when is peak, usage, what rate am I going to get? And that's not the approach that they've been taking. I mean, they have the power bidder, or, whatever their system is. Yeah. And so I think that they're thinking of that towards the future, but one of the main criticisms I've heard is, if you're in an emergency situation and your car begins to drain down while you're asleep, right? Let's say you set a threshold, don't go below 50%. You should be fine. But how much power is that? And is it actually worth your while to feed that back into the grid when the main concern is, oh crap, we're in a blackout event. It's Texas. It's, 1 degrees outside, or 1 degree. And I now have no power and I need to go drive someplace for safety or whatever. And my car now has, 50% of the range or less because it's so cold outside. Now my range is going to be completely shot. And I think from a transportation perspective, there's inherent risks with, using your battery pack within the car versus a power wall where it's kind of assumed that you're going to drain it down and it's going to have no other impact to your life other than just the fact that it's drained. It's not going to inhibit you.
And Kyle, I'm gonna agree with you again, right? I don't think of any kind of car or any other storage medium to be taking energy and then sharing it back, unless it really has its own generation capabilities, because that arbitrage is not worth playing. Electricity prices jumping from the few dollars it is to $9,000. It's a once in a lifetime event. That kind of pain in pricing and the kind of havoc it causes will pretty much guarantee the fact that, unless an even freakier event happens in the future, those prices will never move that much. And so for a vehicle to grid kind of idea to actually take place, the vehicle itself has to be able to generate energy. Without it, it just doesn't make sense.
Well, and for Tesla to bother doing that, right, it's added complexity, which is added expense from both a hardware equipment level and human being research and development, planning and design. And then you're having to work with state and federal regulators and utilities to arrange, like, how do we do this? When do we do this? at the end of the day, it comes down to how do they make any money, right? And I think there is an opportunity there at large scale if you have either enough customers or you're doing large installations like the Australian, Hornsby project, where you're minimizing your costs and you're maximizing your returns, because you might only be playing in this very finite little range, but you've eliminated a lot of the complexity by either centralizing it or whatever. But when it comes to the car, I mean, selfishly, yes, if I have a gigantic battery pack sitting in my driveway, I want the ability to take advantage of it. But for Tesla at that point, it would just be a value proposition, or EV players in general would be a value proposition to customers with a whole bunch of added complexity, both for the design and the installation of like EV chargers in your home, because now that EV charger needs to handle a lot more than just charging your car. And, I don't know if it makes sense for them.
I'm just thinking of a scenario. Forget having a power wall in your home. Forget having solar panels on your home. If you normally use your car, you charge it up using the grid 99.9% of the time. You see on the news that there's going to be a winter storm coming to your area. In anticipation of that, you charge your car all the way up to 100%. You don't drive it. You leave it in your home. The day the storm hits, you press a button. It says energy generation, like battery mode, right? And then you plug that car into your home and you can choose which outlets it works with. I get that there's legislative, state by state considerations with that, but I think even if they just did that for one place like Texas or one state like California, that could be such a big PR success story that it would motivate other states to want to do something like that. And I'm not talking about daily auto bidder, like energy arbitrage things, right? I'm talking about you never use that feature unless it happens in a freak incident like this, and then you turn it on, right?
Yeah, I mean, there is some practical aspects to it in which, like, for that scenario to even take place, at your power breaker, you would need basically like a crossover cabinet or whatever. It's basically a whole separate breaker that you can cut over to. So like you were saying, choosing what circuits you want to include in that power wall, that, V2G circuit, you have to pay an electrician to go and kind of set that up for this to even be possible. And I think that you'd be paying more when you buy the car, because the circuitry within the charging port would need to be different, would need to be bigger and handle that. I think that the thing that I'm most excited about for the Cybertruck is just the simple fact that it has effectively an onboard inverter for 120 and 240 volt service, right? So it's not gonna be a single nice clean, you plug your normal EV charger in and it charges your house. But in an emergency, you could run an extension cord from your truck, into your house, and then have a space heater running off of your EV. I think that's more of a likely emergency scenario, unless we can, sort out the nightmare that is V2G and figure out, like, how do we do this effectively and incentivize the manufacturers to do it as well, because right now they're just not.
And Ron, and your other problem is, if you want to connect it to the home, to make sure that you maximize the power, the usage of that battery, your home needs to be well wired, and you can control where that power goes. Because when you're connected to the grid, every outlet can take power, every appliance can take power. But if you're running off of a truck, you're probably in an emergency situation. Your home needs to be smart enough, and the breaker system needs to be advanced enough where you can be very detailed about which areas of the house is powered and which ones are not. Or else you're probably going to burn through that battery really fast, maybe in just a few hours. I don't know how, depending on the size of the home and what you end up using the energy for. So there's just a lot of small details that need to take place.
So the moral of the story is, everyone that lives in an area, whether California or Texas, that has questionable scenarios like this that could happen to them, should basically just get a Cybertruck.
Yeah, get that
And then what
reservation
you
in.
do is
Yep.
Maybe the next 10 year storm they'll be ready with a Cybertruck for you.
you get
Well,
one
I
of
mean,
those,
in
like,
California, it's just next year, right? So, like,
Yeah.
at least for Californians, and you get the tax credit.
get
So.
those electric stove tops, and then you can cook food that way, and you can just live inside your truck, which has, like, insulation around it, and it, the bed has a cover, right? It's like a
With the rising housing costs of California, you will probably be living in that Cybertruck before too long.
cheapest Cybertruck is $39,000, boys. Like, come on.
Kevin, instead of buying, such an expensive home, just buy 10 or 15 Cybertrucks and then back them up to one another and get a carport to go over the top of all of them.
Yes.
I had never considered that. And then you guys are saying, if I can remote control all 12 cars, I can drive my home to wherever I need to go.
Dude, someone should buy 20 Cybertrucks, anticipate where the blackouts are, drive all 20 Cybertrucks.
No, they drive themselves. They drive themselves.
They drive themselves, right?
So really, the federal government should buy 10 or 20,000 Cybertrucks, park them in Montana or Oklahoma or something, and then when a blackout is projected, they all self-drive themselves to that area of the country, park themselves in each of the people's driveways, right? And then they go, here you go, here's your battery pack, and by the way, it's gonna drive itself off in 48 hours when it gets 25%.
Because you can power your electric stovetop on the Volt on the truck. That's simple. We figured it out. We figured out the California power problem.
Wow. And the Texas problem, right? Just have the federal government buy up every single Cybertruck that's on the
full
power,
disclosure, two of the three of us own stock in Tesla, so we want to be fully transparent that
Tesla's not the only company that offers solar storage. Enphase, with their Enphase Ensemble, offers it. I am not an investor. I am just trying to be neutral over here. Sorry. All right.
But when we're saying there's only one Cybertruck, and we all know who makes that one.
Ford, you listening to this? Your electric F-150 has to power stovetops. The moment you do that, I'll talk about you guys as well.
A coworker of mine has the new F-150 hybrid with the 7.5 kilowatt generator on board, and as a test, they hooked it up and were charging a friend of mine his Model 3 just to see what will happen. What would the Tesla say if I go ahead and plug it into the F-150? It worked great. And so in an emergency situation, I'm not going to say that I think that there's a place for fossil fuels. I mean, I think that there is a energy density, an ease of transportation, and a just-in-time kind of disaster kind of thing where I think it'll be around for a while. A hybrid F-150 in Texas a week ago would have been a lifeline for a lot of people to be able to charge their EVs or charge, devices within their home, heat themselves, go to the gas station.
Kyle, I think you should go work for Ford's marketing department because you are selling it much harder than any advertisement I've ever gotten from Ford for their cars and trucks. I'm not going to lie. I might actually consider looking at it now.
Every electric car has to power an electric stovetop in the future. If you can do that, you're good. That's it. That's the litmus test. I'm excited. All right, we solved the Texas grid problem this episode.
Clearly we solved every single problem. Basically, vehicles need to have battery packs large enough that you can just drive them around, auto drive, to any home that needs it.
Yes. All right. Episode over. This is Driving Green.
And unsubscribed.
Oh, my gosh, I think we just lost 20 million subscribers there.